Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here for this lecture with Michael Kannen. My name is Marta Lambert. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement here at Seattle Chamber Music Society. We're so thrilled to be joined by Michael Kannen, who made the trek all the way from Baltimore to be with us here in Seattle for lectures over the next few days. Michael will be sharing some really special insights about works being performed on SCMS's Summer Festival, so please feel free to check out more information on our website if you would like to learn more about some concerts that we have coming up this summer. If you don't know this already, Michael is first and foremost a cellist. He's a founding member of the Brentano String Quartet, and he's the former director of chamber music at the Peabody Conservatory. Michael, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you to all of you for tuning in today. I'm always so happy to be here at SCMS to talk about music and examine pieces, as Marta said, that are going to be played in the upcoming summer festival. And this year, if you look at the programming, you'll notice that James Ennis has programmed a good number of pieces by American composers, mostly real American classics. And so I thought it would be interesting today to look at a couple of these pieces and to talk, well, think a little bit about, you know, what does it mean for a piece to be American? What is American music? You know, where did it come from? How did it develop our young country? And this story begins, story of American classical music, we're talking about classical music here, begins with this guy, Antonin Dvorak. That's right, Antonin Dvorak. Okay, now, first thing I need to do is say that those of you who have been kind enough to have attended my lectures in the past may have heard this story before, because I have told this story before. So I apologize in advance if you're hearing it again, but it's a good story, and I promise you that I'm going to take it a little further this time than I've ever taken it in the past. So the story of Dvorak in American music actually begins with this remarkable woman, Jeanette Thurber, one of my heroes. As you can see, born in 1850, she lives to the middle of the 20th century. She's born in New York. I believe she's born into a fairly well-off family, if I'm not mistaken, and she takes an early interest in music. She learns to play the flute, and she must be quite talented because she gets herself accepted to study in the Paris Conservatoire. She goes to Paris to study in their conservatory over there. And while she's there, as a young person, she's very impressed with the Paris Conservatory. And the thing that impresses her is that she comes to see that it's a school that is has been set up to champion French music and support French musicians. And most remarkably, it's a school that is funded completely by the state. France, the country of France, decides that their musical heritage is important enough that they need a national conservatory. And Jeanette Thurber thinks, you know what? We need one of those in America. This is what we need. She comes back to America when her studies are done, and she walks the walk. She starts through, I'm sure, incredible effort, not only a music conservatory, but an opera company, both of which are devoted to supporting American musicians and American music. And here's a picture of this, what she called the National Conservatory of Music of America. She founds it in 1885. This is in New York City. And here's the thing. She believes that this is important enough that it should be funded by the United States government. So she goes to Washington and she lobbies Congress. And she convinces them, and they agree to give money to support this National Conservatory of Music. It's a remarkable achievement by this woman, Jeanette Thurber. There's some other things that were kind of extraordinary about this conservatory as well. It was very, very much ahead of its time, very progressive place. For example, this conservatory admitted all people of all races. First of all, it was a racially integrated school. Black people were welcome in this school. That was quite unusual for that time. It promoted women. Women were not welcome in every music conservatory in America at that time. And it was even inclusive of people with disabilities, like there were a number of blind musicians in this place. So it's really, it's like an ideal we're still trying to live up to. And Jeanette Thurber made all this happen. So when the conservatory was founded in 1885, they had a director, of course. There was someone directing the conservatory. And he did that, I can't recall his name, but he did that for about 10 years, and then he had enough, and he decided to retire. And so Jeanette Thurber thought, okay, who can we get now to lead our conservatory? And the person that she decides her conservatory needs as its next director is Antonin Dvorak. Antonin Dvorak. Why Antonin Dvorak? That's the question. Why Antonin Dvorak, of all people? Well, she writes to Dvorak. He's in Prague at the time. She writes to him and lays out the case and says, will you come here and lead our school? And Dvorak writes back and he says, thanks, but I'm really happy here in Prague, and I'm writing my masterpieces, and I'm doing, I'm just like perfectly happy here, so no thank you. And Jeanette Thurber writes back to him and says, this is what the salary will be. And Dvorak writes back to her and says, I'll be there. Jeanette Thurber knew what to do. Apparently, Dvorak's wife was instrumental in having him accept this appointment. So why Dvorak? Why did Jeanette Thurber think that Dvorak, this composer from Bohemia, would be the right person for her school in America? Well, we have to remember that in the 19th century, and we're talking, everything we're talking about here is European classical music, for want of a better term, okay? And in the 19th century, the Germans felt that they owned music. Like this art form was theirs. And we can forgive them, I think, of this, because when you look at, the lineage, just the main people, when you have, in the space of like 150 years or a little over, you have Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Mendelssohn, Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, Mahler, Strauss, Schoenberg, and those are just the big guns. It's one of the most remarkable, just kind of proliferation of genius, musical genius, in a very small geographical place. Germany's about the size of Montana. And all of this creative genius happens in that place. So we get it. But that left all of the composers in other European countries who all knew and revered this tradition, to ask themselves, okay, how can I be part of this overwhelming German tradition, but still speak for my people, still speak in the language of my people? English composers, French composers, Norwegian composers, Russian composers, Bohemian composers, all sort of struggling to figure out, how can I be part of the formal tradition of German music, but using the spices of my country to make it something that is personal to me? And the person who did that best was Dvorak. The way Dvorak was able to absorb this German tradition, His models mainly were Schubert and Brahms, but still speak in such a personal voice. Was and remains remarkable. So he came from Bohemia, and this was his music. So when Jeanette Thurber thought about it, she was thinking about, well, what is American music going to be? What's our music? How can America be part of this great German tradition, but be truly American? And she thought, well, maybe the guy who did it best in Europe can help us to figure that out. And that's why she wanted Dvorak to come here. And it seems like everything she did, she succeeded. So Dvorak comes, he's directing the conservatory, and of course he's teaching composition. And Dvorak has a very, very gifted student, a man named Harry Burleigh. And Harry Burleigh had a beautiful voice. He was a singer, he was studying voice, but he was also studying composition with Dvorak. Harry Burleigh was a black man, he was the descendant of slaves, and he introduces Dvorak to what was called the Negro spiritual. He introduces Dvorak to spirituals, and Dvorak falls in love with this music. He finds it incredibly beautiful, inspiring, and becomes very excited about this music. So Harry Burleigh goes on to be a very successful musician in America. And one of the things that he does is he made some arrangements sort of in the classical style of these spirituals. And I think just to sort of get us started, to get this music in our ear, let's listen to just a snippet of one of his arrangements for chorus of the spiritual Deep River. So this is Harry Burleigh's arrangement for chorus of Deep River. So beautiful. Dvorak is very enamored of it. He really makes a study of spirituals. In fact, after his death back in Prague, after he went home, there was found a pamphlet of Negro spirituals that he took back with him to Bohemia, and here's the crucial thing: Dvorak decides this is American music. This is going to be the source material for American classical musicians. He writes, and forgive the long quotes, but he writes, "I am now satisfied that the future music of this country must be founded upon what are called the Negro melodies. This must be the real foundation of any serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. When I first came here last year, I was impressed with this idea, and it has developed into a settled conviction. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are American. He continues, these are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them. All of the real musicians have borrowed from the songs of the common people. I myself have gone to the simple, half-forgotten tunes of the Bohemian peasants for hints in my most serious work. Only in this way can a musician express the true sentiments of his people. He gets into touch with the common humanity of his country. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. This is this becomes a very complex issue. Whether this, is this truly the music of America? There are all kinds of issues, and it's not our job to talk about that today. But this was Dvorak's conviction. So what he does further, aside from just espousing this view, is he goes about composing pieces to show us how this can be done. And that's how we get a whole bunch of pieces, but maybe most famously, the American String Quartet, the String Quartet Opus 96, which is called the American, which will be played on the festival this summer. There's a viola quintet, which is also nicknamed the American, and of course, most famously, the New World Symphony. Now, these pieces aren't nicknamed these things simply because he wrote them when he was in America. He was deliberately trying to show us how it can be done. These are like YouTube videos for American composers so that they can understand and see how it can be done. And of course, he does it absolutely brilliantly and magnificently. In fact, in the New World Symphony, in the famous slow movement, he writes a tune that is so much like influenced by the spiritual that it actually becomes a spiritual. People put words to it and it becomes known as Going Home, a spiritual. And it's worth listening to this. So we can, if you remember just sort of the flavor of Harry Burleigh's Deep River arrangement, and then listen to this very famous melody from the New World Symphony. Just extraordinary, so beautiful, so good that it actually becomes a little problematic for people a little later on. But this is what Dvorak's project was with these pieces. Now, as I mentioned, the String Quartet in F major, Opus 96, will be performed in the festival this summer. And I wanted to listen to just a few short clips of this piece to kind of point out how he does the same thing in this string quartet that he does in that symphony. We just hear this certain flavor that we somehow recognize as being, coming from certainly the spiritual and somehow from American in a little bit. For example, in the first movement, sorry, Marta, we're skipping the great viola solo at the beginning, although it is also indicative of this, but we're going right to the second theme, and we can hear once again this kind of the flavor of the spiritual. Beautiful, beautiful. In the second movement, this very unusual and haunting movement, and and I should say also that in this movement, I almost hear the influence of indigenous American music. Now, I've not in my readings really turned up much about Dvorak's exposure to indigenous music. He did, as famously, travel to Iowa and spent time out there. Maybe he did here, I don't know, but he certainly, in the quote that we read just earlier, he was really focused on the spirituals. But in this movement, in any case, it's we recognize the flavor again. So this is the opening of the second movement of this great quartet. The cello now takes up that tune, and the violin and the cello pass it back and forth. It's a hypnotic, beautiful movement. In the last movement of this piece, we get maybe a little less of the spiritual or indigenous music, but we do get something that at the time is very closely associated somehow with America, and that's the West. And the frontier and trains. The trains that are connecting the country and making it possible now for us to travel across this huge continent. Dvorak was obsessed with trains. Dvorak was a bit OCD, and he was what they call a train spotter. He would memorize train schedules, and then he would go out and sit and watch the trains go by and say, oh, that's the 8:17, and that's the... and in the last movement of this piece, we get a little bit of that train vibe. So, yeah, trains, and I, especially that last part, you can imagine horseback riding as well. So, so this is Dvorak's great piece. If you should come to the festival to hear the concert on which it's played, to keep in mind, I think, the way in which it is not only just the most delightful and beautiful and brilliant string quartet, but this idea that it's Dvorak showing us what our classical music could be like. So then the question arises, was he right? Did it happen? Well, the answer is yes and no. There were composers in the late 19th, early 20th century who did explore this idea of using the black music as source material. Many of those composers were black composers, in fact. Going from the top left and clockwise, it's Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who actually wasn't an American. He was British, but he did come over to this country, and William Grant Still and William Dawson and Florence Price. And there were some white composers as well, like George Whitefield Chadwick, who gave it a shot, like using the black music as source material and integrating it into this sort of European tradition. And just to give you an example now, and I should say that these people, not all of their music did that, but some of their pieces did. For example, Florence Price's Piano Quintet from 1936. Let's listen to the opening of this. It's a beautiful piece, a piece well worth playing, for sure. Let's listen to just the very opening of George Chadwick's String Quartet. And we hear him attempting the same thing. Once again, this is a beautiful piece. I've played it myself. The problem is that the whole time that I'm playing it, I was thinking, wow, this really sounds like Dvorak. and this is one of the challenges that existed for these composers, is that Dvorak did it so well that he cast a really long shadow. And it was hard, I think, for these composers not to sound like Dvorak doing American music. But as I said, it's beautiful music. It's music that's well worth playing. But it didn't really catch on as the real deep well of source material that Dvorak hoped or thought that it would. There's a very interesting book, recent book, for those of you who are interested. It's called Dvorak's Prophecy, and it's by the critic Joseph Horowitz, and it deals precisely with this whole issue of Dvorak's idea. And at the very beginning, writing the introduction of his book, Horowitz writes this. In 1893, the Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak, residing in New York City, predicted that a, quote, great and noble school of American classical music would be founded upon America's Negro melodies. This prophecy was famous, influential, and controversial. In retrospect, it was shrewd, compassionate, and naive. The black musical motherlode migrated into popular realms, the music that defines America to this day. Now, this is a very, very important point, that the black music that Dvorak was so interested in became the source material for jazz and the blues and eventually rock and roll. Three absolutely uniquely American art forms, original American art forms, and ones that became far, far, far more widespread and influential than any classical music that was being written here. So he was right that that music becomes extraordinarily influential, but maybe not in quite the way that he imagined. He goes on to write, does Horowitz, a misleading narrative popularized by Aaron Copland, Virgil Thomson, and Leonard Bernstein maintained that there was no American music of consequence before 1910. During interwar decades, when literary historians and writers identified a, quote, usable past that included Emerson and Thoreau, Whitman, and Melville, American composers decided they had none. It distanced American composers and institutions of performance from Dvorak's prophecy. The anchoring American canon Dvorak anticipated never materialized. So, which directions did American music go in? Well, of course, and again, American classical music we're talking about here. It went in a million different directions, way too many to even summarize here. But what I'd like to do now is look at another piece that's going to be played on the festival this year, one of the most famous American pieces, by one of the guys who so annoys Joseph Horowitz for what they did, and that person is Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland, who, from early through the mid 20th century becomes like the avatar of American music. He becomes the quintessential American composer. He's born in 1900 in Brooklyn, and like all of these people who go on to do these things, he shows a very early aptitude to music. He studies music, he becomes a very good pianist, and he's studying composition. Now it's interesting to look at who he studies with. He's studying with, first of all, Reuben Goldmark from 1917 to 1921. Okay, so he's age 17 to 21. He's studying with Goldmark. Goldmark is straight old school German classical music. Like Goldmark, like he believed it was like Bach, and he would stretch to Richard Strauss, but that was music. It didn't go any further than that. That's all you need to know. That was the person that Copland was studying. So he gets a real grounding in the straight down the middle German tradition. Then in 1921, he goes to Paris. And there he begins to study with the legendary figure Nadia Boulanger, who was one of the most brilliant musicians and teachers of her day, and the teacher of many, many important composers, American, European. She's a towering figure. And so Copland is studying with her. He's getting the best education just in composition and music from her. And also while he's there, he's being introduced and exposed to the great intellectual thoughts of the day that are going on in Paris and in Europe in general. And then he comes home in 1924. And when he comes home, he's writing music, he's casting about, and he falls kind of in with a crowd of intellectual artists that's being led by this guy, Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz, of course, was a pioneering photographer and a very, very influential figure. He eventually married Georgia O'Keeffe, but also people like Ansel Adams and Walker Evans, these great photographers of the age. And Stieglitz states that American artists should reflect the ideas of American democracy. There's this real sort of patriotic feeling that American art should be American. It should reflect America. So, how does Copland respond to that? Well, one of the ways that he does, and that's just interesting to look at, is this idea that jazz has become very influential. And there are not a lot of, someone like Reuben Goldmark, his teacher, is not going to have anything to do with this jazz. But Copland, of course, decides, well, this is kind of interesting, and maybe I can incorporate some of this into my pieces, which is doing what, Jeanette Thurber wanted, right? He's taking an American art form and bringing it into classical music. So in 1926, he writes a piano concerto, and it's instructed to listen to just a little bit of this. This is from a performance much later, a TV broadcast that Leonard Bernstein does of the piano concerto with Aaron Copland himself as the soloist. So we're going to listen to a little clip of this just from the middle of the piece. And you'll see how when this clip starts, it really sounds like, modern music. It's dissonant, it's craggy, it's this. But notice how it just suddenly kind of morphs into something different. Pretty good pianist, that guy, Copland. So yeah, now remember, the jazz we're talking about, this is the 20s. We're talking about swing and ragtime, which you kind of hear in this. And so this is how Copland kind of brings that into his piece. And we'll just listen to another clip when the full orchestra kind of takes up this idea. No one could conduct this stuff like Leonard Bernstein. So, and of course, Bernstein and others, this is a sound that comes to Broadway as well, another American original. So this is one way in which composers, and Copland certainly, has begun to bring these more popular forms into classical music, and that continues to this day. I mean, rock and roll becomes extremely influential. And composers today who have such wide range of influences are using all of that stuff. So Copland is writing, he's writing music like this. He's pretty successful, actually. He's getting commissions from people like Koussevitzky and the Boston Symphony. Koussevitzky really champions his music, and he's doing okay. But then he starts to write ballets. And when he starts to write ballets, that's when things really go right for him. They become enormously popular and enormously successful. And the thing is, he's writing ballets and also concert pieces on American themes. Okay? So, Billy the Kid in 1938, a Western figure, a real person, but sort of mythology. Rodeo in 1942. Appalachian Spring, which is the piece that will be played on the festival this year in 1944. And then the concert pieces, the Lincoln Portrait and the Fanfare for the Common Man. And these pieces make Copland extremely famous and extremely popular. Now, it's worth looking for 1 second at why that is. I mean, first of all, they're the American subjects, of course. This kind of starts to identify Copland as the quintessential American composer. But what he does in this music is, he's writing music of the sort like we hear in the piano concerto. Good new music. He has a very distinctive voice. We hear it, and the music he's writing, in the 30s, sounds a little like this. So this is just the opening of his what he called short symphony, written for the Boston Symphony, and it sounds like this. This is the first minute or so of this piece. Okay, so, 1930s would be good modern music. Maybe we wouldn't identify it so much as like American themed or anything, but just Copland, very original voice, modern music. What he does then in his ballets is he kind of sands down the edges of this music, like we just heard. And he just takes away some of the corners, and he makes it a little easier going. And that's how you get music that sounds a little like this, music that will maybe be familiar to you, but shares some of the actual material of the short symphony, but sounds like this. So we still recognize it as the same composer, very much so, but it's just a little easier to take in. Now, Copland takes a lot of heat for this. The so-called serious composers of the day, academic, all the people in academia, just accuse him of selling out. They are not happy that he has gone in this direction, and they're not happy that it's become so popular. And it should be noted that Copland didn't write this kind of music for the rest of his life. In fact, later in his life, he gets interested in serialism, like real Schoenbergian serialism, and puts his own personal stamp on that as well. But for these ballets, the ballets that make him famous, this is what he's done. So that brings us to Appalachian Spring, the piece that you're going to hear on your festival this summer. Appalachian Spring is a result of a collaboration with this towering figure, Martha Graham, the queen of modern dance, a brilliant figure in art. And Martha Graham was commissioned to produce a ballet by this amazing person, Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. Now, Elizabeth Coolidge was a great patron of the arts, a wealthy woman. She loved new music. She loved contemporary music. That was her thing. And in particular, contemporary chamber music. And she commissioned countless pieces from American composers to be performed. She was associated with the Library of Congress in Washington. The beautiful concert hall in the Library of Congress is still called the Coolidge Auditorium. And she commissions Martha Graham to make a ballet, and she suggests Aaron Copland as the composer. And Martha Graham agrees to this, and you see a picture of Martha Graham and Eric Hawkins, who was the other dancing star, with Elizabeth Coolidge at the piece's premiere in 1944 at the Library of Congress. And one thing that I noted with amusement, Elizabeth Coolidge was quite worried that Aaron Copland would not accept the commissioning fee. He was so well known at that point. Her commissioning fee of $500 she was worried about. Now, I was a little alarmed that Appalachian Spring, that he only got $500 for this, but I did the conversion into today's dollars, and it's actually almost $10,000. So we can rest assured that Aaron Copland was properly compensated for his piece. So there's no theme. Elizabeth Coolidge said to Martha Graham, write about, dance whatever you want. Whatever the story is, you can do it. And it's funny how we see these things. We think Appalachian Spring, well, it's so indicative of America in a time and place. But the fact is, Aaron Copland didn't know what he was writing about. He said in an interview, I was really putting Martha Graham to music. I had seen her dancing so many times, and I had a sense of her personality as a creative force. Really, in front of my mind, I wasn't thinking about Appalachians or even spring. So I had no title for it. It was just a ballet for Martha. That was actually the subtitle that I had, Ballet for Martha. That's what he was writing. Martha Graham made up this whole story, and it was really only very close to when the whole thing was done, that Copland and Graham met, and Copland asked her, well, what are you going to call it? And she said, I'm going to call it Appalachian Spring. And Copland said, oh, what a nice name. Where'd you get it? And she said, well, it's the title of a poem by Hart Crane. And I said, oh, does the poem have anything to do with the ballet? And she said, no, I just liked the title, and I took it. And then Copland goes on to say, and over again nowadays, people come up to me after seeing the ballet on stage and say, Mr. Copland, when I see that ballet and when I hear your music, I can just see the Appalachians. I've begun to see the Appalachians myself a little bit. But so it's a real lesson, you know, with like things we project onto music. Appalachian Spring sounds so American, but really when the music was written, there was no theme involved. It was just his music. It was just ballet music for Martha. Now, one of the other things that makes us associate Appalachian Spring with somehow Americanness is the fact that famously he uses a shaker melody in the piece. "'Tis a gift to be free." Very famous melody. Of course, shakers, they actually came from the UK. There was a movement of shakers in America. They were mostly up in New England. But he uses this melody, and it's a famous melody, and I thought it would be nice just to hear a little bit as it might be heard sung in a shaker meeting. Very plain, very simple, unharmonized. This is what this music was.
'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis a gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend we shan't be ashamed. To turn, will be our delight. By turning, we come round right.
Simple. Copland takes this melody and makes it not so simple. He writes, in fact, variations on that melody in his piece. So, Appalachian Spring, the story, very basically, it's the wedding day of two young people in Western Pennsylvania, and what you will hear in the concert is a suite from the ballet. The original ballet had about 14 different movements. What happened was that Copland, very soon after the ballet premiered, he arranges 8 of those movements for orchestra. He creates a suite from the ballet, and he makes it for full orchestra. That's where the piece becomes most famous and most known. And then he takes the suite and he puts it back to the original 13 instruments. Elizabeth Coolidge, one of her stipulations was this must be for a chamber ensemble, not only because she liked it, but because that's all that would fit in the Library of Congress pit. So she said no more than 10 to 12 instruments, and Copland stretches it to 13. And that's what you will hear in the concert. By the way, a year after, the piece is premiered in Washington in 1944. A year later, in 1944, it comes to New York, and it gets an incredible amount of attention for a couple of reasons. One, it wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1945, his score for Appalachian Spring. And two, the New York premiere happens just a few days after VE Day, after World War II ends. And there is this incredible feeling of jubilation, this ecstatic feeling in the country that this years-long catastrophe is finally over. And there's a real longing for more simple days. And so this piece just was right there to feed into this feeling. I'd like to close. I thought this would be the nicest thing to do. I will stop talking. And about 15 years after the premiere of this piece, of the ballet rather, Martha Graham did another production of Appalachian Spring for TV recording. It wasn't the original cast, but she continues to dance in it. And you can find this on YouTube. And it's very, very beautiful, very moving, I think. And so I thought, as a way of introducing the music to you, but also so that you can have in your mind's eye, as you listen to the suite played in the chamber music version on the stage, what the ballet looked like. So the cast of characters, very briefly, there's what was called this old woman who comes on, played in this ballet by a very young woman, and then there's this couple that's going to get married, and the young bride is danced by the not now very young-looking Martha Graham. So it's a little confusing because the old woman is young and the young woman is older. And then there's a preacher, and then there are four sort of members of a corps de ballet. So 2 excerpts from the ballet with the original instrumentation that you will hear in the concerts. This is Martha Graham dancing Appalachian Spring. Let's get it started. Now I'd like to play for you just a little of the variations on the Shaker tune, "'Tis a Gift to be Simple, 'Tis a Gift to be Free." And we get to see Martha Graham dancing a little more, and we can hear how Copland used that tune in the ballet.